It's 8:30 on Saturday, September 30th. The last day of September. Right now it's about 70 degrees. It's supposed to get to like 91 or 92. I said the forecast for Saturday a while back was 99, but it's much cooler than that, thankfully. I'm in the third cell of the fourth section, the rotation that started on September 15th. So we're almost halfway through this section. The bull had crossed the wire last night. He lined up, he wanted to get back in. I think he was thirsty, so I opened up the wire and he walked in pretty much. He just needed a little convincing. The bull's getting water right now. Let's see if we can find him. No, he's coming back. He's right there, he's coming back. He got his water. Anyway, the western part of this cell is pretty dry. This is not great. But the eastern part is pretty good. So let's walk over to the eastern part into the sunlight. Oh, by the way, I should mention that right now it's the Korean holiday of Chuseok, which is like a harvest festival. It's probably the most important holiday in Korean culture. Everybody goes back to their family and they have a little feast together, spend some time together. So yeah, Chuseok is based on the lunar calendar, not the solar calendar. So you can see it's getting quite a bit greener here. There's lots of little pieces of grass. And I'm only halfway there to the end. The goat weed's a lot shorter too. You know, now the grass is getting thicker and greener. Even more thicker and greener. Look at that. A bit of grass down there. Some there. Yeah, Chuseok. One of the traditions is traditional Koreans do this. The Protestants, not so much. They put up a portrait of their ancestors and they lay out a meal for them and they bow 3 times, right, head to the ground, to reverence their ancestors. The idea, it was explained to me by my brother-in-law. He says he has to show his son to how to properly, care for him, so when he's old, he'll be taken care of. And if your parents have passed, you can't show your son how to take care of your parents directly, so you have to do it symbolically. But that's how they build up the link, the chain that links their different generations together. So Chuseok's an important holiday for Korean culture. We don't really have anything quite like it. Thanksgiving is probably the closest, but Thanksgiving is quite a different holiday and celebration. The grass here is super thick, by the way, and tall, like 3 feet tall. We've morphed Thanksgiving. We've lost the original meaning of Thanksgiving, and popular culture has tried to reprogram us to think it's about thanking each other, when that's not even close to the truth. The idea of Thanksgiving was giving thanks to God. And so when you have your Thanksgiving dinner, be sure to say a prayer of thanks to God for all the things that He's done for us. He sustains us every day. Life comes from Him. It's sustained by Him. So if you're alive, you have Him to thank for it. So that's the closest thing we have. Our link to our ancestors, it really bothers me when people speak ill of their parents. It's like if even your children don't like you, it's like, that's pretty depressing thought. At least your family should like you and care for you, right? It's not about like how good of a parent you were or not, or how good of a child you were or not. You should always know that there's people out there that love you and care for you and want what's best for you. no matter what. Obviously, situations get out of hand. Obviously, parents have to kick their kids out of the nest eventually, so they can learn to fly on their own wings. But there should always be the understanding that there's a bond of love and compassion and things like that through all the generations, parent and child, and so on and so forth. I don't need to really describe to you the importance of family. Well, maybe I do nowadays because we've lost it. We've gone full berserk on the individualism front in American society. It didn't used to be this way. It's probably in the 60s, I think, when we really left the ranch. So when the founding fathers, when they were talking about individual rights, they weren't talking about single persons. The idea that people have rights outside of the context of their family is really a strange and foreign concept. The founding fathers saw the head of household, the father of the house, as the individual, if there was such an individual, who embodied or who possessed those rights that were given from God. And the other members of the family were dependent upon the father. And the father was expected, obviously, to care for them and provide for them and such. And the wife is an equal partner, So the unit of the family really was who they believed had the rights. An individual by himself really can't do much. We need to sleep, we need to eat. We can't be awake 24 hours a day. We get sick, we get tired, we need rest, And so individuals aren't really worth much on their own. They really can't do much on their own. They need a family behind them. And in Roman society, Rome was one of the archetypes that we used. In Roman society, they had, I don't know the right way to put this and the right way to describe this, but the families were the unit of society. They were, so the head of household, the patrician, was basically judge, jury, executioner for his family, right? If one of the members of his household did something wrong, he was expected to punish that person, like if they murdered or something like that, he was expected to take their life. If there was a dispute between the families, it was settled by the patricians talking to each other or coming to some form of agreement. The people who served on the Senate and as consul and in those positions, they were individuals, but they had families behind them. They weren't just people acting on their own, but they represented a group of people, the atomic unit of society, not the individual, but the family. Anglo-Saxon ways, very similar. The traditions of our society, of our people, is that we would organize ourselves by family, right, into, villages, right? People living close to each other, and we would appoint an earl. And that earl, that word sounds a lot like the word jarl in other languages that are very similar to ours. And that earl was basically a representative of the heads of household. And should the need arise, he would call upon the heads of household to endorse or ratify whatever action needed to take place. And obviously the heads of household would be the people who would show up with arms when it was time to fight, to defend their property and such like that. And the kings, the Anglo-Saxon kings weren't kings in the ordinary sense. They were probably better described as big earls, right? So the earls would meet together in times of crisis, and they would elect a king who would organize the troops during the time of crisis. And then once the time of crisis passed, he was expected to step down and return. You know, the Norman conquest obviously changed a lot. You know, the Normans came in with the new ideas that the king had absolute authority and that he should always be reigning. And it wasn't just in times of emergency, but at all times he can call upon the people to sacrifice for him, right? And obviously the Anglo-Saxon people didn't like that idea very much, which led to a lot of issues that still haven't been resolved today. We're still fighting the Norman invasion in our hearts and minds. We, as Anglo-Saxons, we long for the time when we were free and not ruled by anyone, and when no one could stand up and say, I have the right to be king. And we just want to live on our farms, raise our animals and our families, and be left alone. Really, that's our ethos, our ethos. But so the founding fathers described rights. They were using concepts from a man named John Locke, who, if you don't know who John Locke was, he's the guy that explained that kings should serve a certain role in society and government had a certain purpose. And that purpose wasn't to enrich themselves, but it was to protect the people that they were supposed to serve. And that's all biblical, right? And furthermore, that when kings and governments went beyond the scope of what they were supposed to do and even started abusing the people and infringing on their rights. Infringe is a term that I think we've forgotten what that means. So infringe means to slowly encroach upon. If my neighbor took his fence line and every year he moved it an inch, right? That's an infringement. And so, like with the Second Amendment, it says, the right to keep and bear arms should not be infringed, right? It's talking about even small intrusions into the right to keep and bear arms. And so things like having to pay a tax to obtain a weapon would be certainly an infringement. And certainly things like you can only buy certain weapons, or you have to pass a background check to obtain a weapon. Those are definitely infringements, and thus contrary to the Second Amendment. I think that the Supreme Court is rapidly fixing the past 50 years of infringements. No, it's 100 years now, because the NFA, the National Firearms Act, was a very gross infringement of our rights. And to this day, the topic of suppressors has not, it was thrown into the bill with no purpose whatsoever, no justification. And without any justification, it's an infringement. It's a gross violation of our rights. The idea also that if you pay the tax stamp, it's 100% legal, but if you don't, you're going to prison for 20 years, is also an infringement, right? The punishment for not paying a tax should be you pay the tax, right? But even putting a tax on a firearm, I think, is a gross infringement. And in California right now, they're trying to ban firearms by taxing them to death. So, yeah. Anyway, so the Founding Fathers granted rights, didn't grant rights, they recognized rights. The rights of the household, right? And the father, as head of the household, is the sort of representative or the embodiment of that ideal, that concept. But certainly an individual man really didn't have much to worry about. He really wasn't that much of a threat or things like that. Another concept that I think we've lost is this idea that rights exist to protect the weak. The concept goes something like this. There's someone in society who's weak and they're oppressed. Other people are bullying them. And so we should use the excuse that, oh, they must be infringing on some of his rights somehow. And so we need to use the force of government to punish those who have infringed on his rights, right? And this concept is wholly alien, I think, to our founding and our national ideas and our culture and our heritage. The idea of rights isn't that people should leave you alone. It's that you should pursue the things that are correct and proper, right? When it comes to other people who want to infringe on your rights, you honestly have to rely on your own strength to protect yourself. And if that strength isn't enough, then you can call upon your neighbors and hopefully they'll be kind enough to volunteer to protect your rights as well, right? And the purpose of government isn't to address every single instance of abuse on the individual scale, right? The purpose of government is to provide a means whereby everyone can come together for those issues that affect everyone, right? Like war. Like foreign politics, foreign relations, those things affect everybody. And so really the government should not be concerned at all with whether somebody says something to somebody else. It doesn't matter because the government doesn't care, right? If somebody feels slighted or offended or whatever, upset, that's up to them to take care of that, right? And people can resolve the law among themselves. You don't need courts to tell them what to do. The law exists. You follow the law. You use the law to justify your actions, basically. That's what you do. That's what it's there for. It's kind of an excuse to do certain things that we think is right and proper, and also an excuse to stop certain things that we deem are not right and proper, right? It's not a method of employing the resources of the government to act in someone's behalf, right? That's not what it's about. It's quite different than that, at least originally. And so the idea was that individuals would secure for themselves the means to protect themselves and would develop their own little alliances and their friendships. And the community acting together in their own self-common interest can protect themselves from threats at the community level, and the state can address threats at the state level, but individuals address threats at the individual level, right? Let me give you an example. Let's say somebody decided to block my way to my property, right? So he decided to build a roadblock or something like that so that I couldn't access my property. And since I deem it a right to access my property, and since they're curtailing that right, or they're infringing upon that right, then it would be up to me to resolve that with my neighbor. So I'd probably go to him and say, hey neighbor, you've blocked my gate. I can't get to my property. Please remove the obstruction, right? And if he refused or if he became agitated about it, the resolution would simply be I would move the barrier myself. And if it came to fighting, then I would be expected to be able to defend myself in some kind of altercation or fight with my neighbor. That's kind of the assumption on how those things are resolved, right? So I could appeal to my neighbor's, best senses. If my neighbor was a lot stronger than me, I could appeal to the people in the community, the neighbor's friends. Like if my property was small and he was big, I could go to the people around me and say, hey, this guy, he's really, messing our stuff up. We should work together to stop him from interfering with our rights, And that's kind of the way it was supposed to work. Now, if the neighbor decided to recruit a small army, a mob, a gang, and that's where, the posse posse comitatus, right? The idea there is that in certain occasions, we basically suspend normal operations of government and behavior, and we behave as if we're being invaded, right? And so the local sheriff or some local leader could say, hey, I want everybody to show up here with your guns and your horses. We're going to go take care of this big threat that's affecting everybody. We're just going to go to the bandit hideout. We're just going to kill everyone. Or we're going to go to this guy's property and we're going to go get our horses back, or whatever it is that they wanted to accomplish, you know. And so that's a natural right. You have a natural right, if necessary, to organize yourselves into a small army or militia and go take military actions if necessary to protect your rights, you know. That's not something that affects the state or the country. And so the governments of the state and the country really have nothing to say about that, other than to leave people alone and let them do their thing. And if you start infringing on their rights, let them address that concern, you know. So that's kind of the ideas that the founding fathers had. They envisioned a society that was governed by law, but not by government. They envisioned a society where people had to resolve their own issues. They had to take care of themselves. They envisioned a society where the government existed to fill a vacuum and deprive other competing governments from arising. And at the same time, such a government was severely limited in what it was able to do and how it was able to act, so that the government became not just the alternative of last resort, right? The place you go when nothing else works, but also a place where people who have malicious intent, what you might call the sociopaths among us, where they would go to become entangled in all of these, you know, legal things and rights and elections and all that kind of stuff. And they would consume all their resources trying to capture government. And in the end, they'd have nothing left to do, because once they've captured the government's ineffectual. It's powerless to do basically anything, right? That's kind of the idea there. And that's why the federal government is structured the way it is. That's why it's so hard to do anything in the federal government, right? That's why it's so easy to override the federal government. And there's so many different ways that you can outright disobey the federal government and get away with it, right? That's kind of the concept there. Now, in the modern society, obviously things are very different than they were envisioned in the beginning. Lots of very bad people over a long time have changed government subtly to become a ruler, right? They decided that government should tell people what to do and how to do it, and they decided that government should oppress people who they disagree with. My favorite example is the idea that there's people in society who think that, you know, let's say whites are better than everybody else, and they think that, you know, this country should be full of whites and nothing else. And so because these people are apparently a threat on the national level, we need to employ federal resources to oppress these people, because apparently having an opinion that's contrary to the rest of society is so dangerous, so utterly dangerous, that it must be compared with an invasion of a foreign country, right? That we need to use national taxes and national resources to stop this grave threat, right? When in reality, it's just a bunch of people who have opinions that are different than yours, you know, and the vast majority of them don't ever do anything about it. And the ones that do, you can resolve that locally. If you're concerned that your local black church might get burned to the ground by a white supremacist, there's a very simple solution, a very simple solution. You have one of the members carry a rifle. You patrol the church 24/7. You take turns, you know, and when the white supremacist shows up with torches or whatever, you shoot him. The problem is solved. It doesn't require government to get involved even in the slightest. The only way government might get involved is said like, oh, you shot a guy who showed up with a bunch of Molotov cocktails and threatened to burn down your church. Well, that's self-defense. You know, there's no crime here. There's nothing to prosecute. You know, go home, And oh, by the way, we should probably reimburse you for the ammo that you use to protect your property. You know, that's the limit of what government should be doing in such a case. You know, is allowing people to exercise their natural rights to protect themselves, right? Instead of interfering and saying like, oh no, you can't do that. You can't bring guns to church. You can't have armed guards. You can't patrol your church 24/7. You know, that's the kind of thing that rights are supposed to be, is allowing people to do that which is natural and correct and proper. So anyway, that's kind of the long and short of it. I'm what is this, 3 days in a row of ranting? I don't know if I'm going to post the last rant that I went off on, but yeah, this is something that I think we need to shift our thinking on, is rather than asking what government can do for me, or you know, how we can use government to give ourselves some kind of upper hand or benefit, or should we use government to right wrongs? You know, we should be asking, what can I do to protect my own rights? What can I do to fix the problems in my life? What can I do to make myself stronger and happier? And by I don't mean like individuals acting alone. I mean families, right? Families acting in their own self-interest for their members. You know, fathers and mothers working for the benefit of their children, and children supporting their parents, and things like that. That's what we should be focused on, is not you know, who's going to win the next election, but you know, how can we better fill the roles within our own family. That's kind of what we should be thinking about all the time. Anyway, guys, have a great day. Take care, and bye-bye.